So what to say about this visit, and what do the two sides expect to achieve eventually in Moscow? For now, we are joined by Dimitri Barba, who is a political analyst focusing on the politics of Russia and also of the region. He is coming from the Sputnik International News Agency. Later, we're also going to be joined by other analysts focusing on the Middle East and also from the United States. Let me ask you, Mr. Barbish, many see this as a very surprise visit. I mean, a long-time foes. Back to the days, former Soviet Union, then about Chechnya, and then about Syria war. None of them have been agreed by the two sides, and now they're meeting one another. What does it say?
Well, I would say that the relationship between Russia and Saudi Arabia had its ups and downs, but I wouldn't say that the Saudis have always kept their position intact. You are right to mention Chechnya. We had that problem with the Saudis in the 1990s when the Saudi kingdom, at least some people from its territory, obviously supported the Chechen rebels. You know, these were the same people, you know, basically the people of the kind of Bin Laden, you know. These same people who have been fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, these same kind of Saudis, they came to Chechnya to help the Chechen rebels. But back in the early 2000s, the head of the Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki, came to Russia, and he promised, there was a talk between him and Putin, Prince Turki promised to stop the support for the Chechen rebels, and he held his word. If you look at the history of the Chechen conflict, the power of the uprising in Chechnya started to wane exactly at the moment when the Saudis stopped supplying them with money.
But what about the civil war in Syria? I mean, Russia certainly is supporting the Syria president. Well, Saudi Arabia totally against.
Yes. Well, the next point of friction was in 2011 when obviously the Saudi kingdom supported the armed uprising in Syria while Russia supported the government. And for 4 years there was no talk between us, but in 2015 the crown prince, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, came to Russia. Again, it was the Saudi initiative. He came to Russia and he started mending the ties, promising Saudi investment. Why did that happen? I can explain. First, during the war, the Saudis basically tried to bribe Russia. They offered billions in exchange for the cessation of Russian support for President Assad. This could have worked in Yeltsin's times, but Putin is simply a different kind of president. He will not allow Russia to be humiliated by basically being bribed.
So how can you explain the making
Saudis
offensive?
Realized it.
Yes. So how can you explain in brief words what does it mean now?
That's what I'm coming to. When the Saudis realized that they cannot bribe Russia, when they realized that their allies in Syria, the radical Sunni Muslims, the radicals, are losing the battle. Right now, the Islamic State controls only 10% of the Syrian territory. They started to get a taste for negotiations. Also, the Saudis.
So you say negotiations, Mr. Barbish, since you are much more an insider than us, let's just say, coming from Russia's perspective. What kind of negotiations, what kinds of agreement has been reached this time regarding Syria? The president will go or not, this time said by Saudi when the Saudi king visited Moscow. Well, very briefly, one word or two, please, from you, sir.
Officially, no. Officially, there is no link between the economic ties between Russia and Saudi Arabia and the situation on the ground in Syria. But everyone understands that without basically the victory of Syrian troops with Russian help in Syria, the king would have never come to Russia. His visit is an acknowledgement of the fact that the Saudi kingdom and Russia are going to seek compromise in Syria. That compromise is now not made public, but clearly this compromise will not include the United States, They're allies in the European Union.
All right, and
why?
we have
Because
someone
these
from the
people
United
lost
States.
in
Let's also
Syria.
give
Their
time to the
clients
others
have
to
lost.
talk as well. Let's have Eiland, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. He's joining us from Florida in the United States. Sir, Mr. Eiland, I want to ask you about that. Many say the Saudi king, longtime ally of the United States in the Middle East, the ultimate ally, some even say, now go to Russia for the very first time for this landmark trip. It means a breakup from the United States, looking for a different option and alternative, and possibly very different policies. What would you say?
Well, it's very curious because, you know, I know that our president, Donald Trump, is very erratic, may even be unfit for office of the president. But surprisingly, he's been pretty steadfast in his own support of Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia was disappointed that the bureaucracy, that is Tillerson and some of the other people, were less supportive of the Saudi blockade and sanctions against Qatar. And I think so. I think the Saudis do feel that he's unreliable. The president of the United States is unreliable because there's a tension within the government on what to do about Saudi's actions. And there's also tensions over the Yemen issue because Saudi Arabia has been really bombing Yemen indiscriminately for a long time. So I think there's turmoil in the U.S. government as to what to do about Saudi Arabia, and they're picking up that uncertainty,
right,
even though Trump himself has been pretty supportive of Saudi Arabia, but the underlying government, the bureaucracies, have not been as supportive, have been more even-handed in the Yemen issue and also in the Qatar issue.
You know,
so
Mr. Eiland,
I think that's why he's going to Russia.
But Mr. Eiland, you know how much distrust or lack of trust there has to be for a long-time ally between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Now, going to Russia for the very first time and talk about different kinds of options, at least according to our Russian scholars. So how much distrust really is there? You talk about the bureaucracy. Yes, maybe there is some going on between the administration, within it, differences about how to deal with Saudi Arabia, but the divide has to be really there, really deep. And the uncertainty has to be really strong for a long-time ally going to a very different country and option such as Russia. Mr. Eiland, very briefly from you.
Well, I would agree with that statement. However, from my perspective, Saudi Arabia has not been that good of an ally, and it's a myth that we need the Saudis for the oil, because the world oil market will provide the oil at the cheapest possible price. So I see no problem with this. But that's certainly what you said is true. I think the Saudis are nervous that the U.S. has become an unreliable ally and are seeking to hedge their bets by going to Russia.
And now we're also joined in Washington, D.C., Ali alAhmed, who is the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. He's certainly a scholar for the Saudi analyzing, and also he's been focusing on the politics of the Persian Gulf region and also the Middle East as a whole. It's great to have you, sir. Listening to your other colleagues, their comments, this is going to be quite a different approach King Salman took compared to all his predecessors in the past decades, going to Russia and seeking an option different from the United States. I'm sure he's going to meet a lot of different opinions back at home.
Well, I think this is not the first time that the Saudis intended to send a message to Washington that, oh, we don't need you anymore, we're moving eastward. And King Abdullah, the previous king, did the same thing when he visited China. And the Saudis, typically when they try to exaggerate everything that they do, they said, oh, we are now moving toward China and the eastern world, as a way to basically blackmail or graymail the United States in its position. I do not think this visit is of important in terms of strategically. it is a visit that is intended to have some kind of a warm relationship with Russia, because that has not been the case. And the reception by the Russians have been mixed as well. You know, typically if the Russians wanted to show a great fanfare, Putin would receive the visiting dignitary, and he didn't do that. So there has been mixed messages. Not much has come out of this visit, but signing memorandums of understanding.
I see.
So I don't think this is really a big visit like the Saudis are trying hard to make it. Maybe to push the Americans to do something. I'm not sure, but I don't really see it as a historical visit, except the fact that this is the first Saudi king to visit Moscow.
Well, that is already quite significant, isn't it, given what the governance style is like in Saudi Arabia. Mr. Ahmed, I want to just ask you one further question briefly. Look at Russia, look at Saudi Arabia. Both are oil exporters. They are big oil exporters. They are competitors with one another. Think about that. And now they're meeting one another, and now they're showing a very warm attitude toward each other. Is this not going to be strategic, as you just mentioned? Is this going to be all make-up for both countries? I just don't believe that, Mr. Ahmed.
Well, before the king himself visited, one thing we must understand, that the king visit to Moscow is ceremonial, because he is not the person who actually makes the decision anymore. It's his son. His son visited Russia earlier this year, and I think that was much more important, because that's the business side of the visit. There is an importance in the fact that these are leading oil exporters, and they talk. However, the Russians are very upset at the Saudis undermining their own economy by selling cheap oil. And I think that was one of the issues the Russians have had with the Saudis, and I think the relationship is really, this is a major issue. The Obama administration asked the Saudis to drop the oil prices to hurt Russia, and the Russians have not forgotten that. So I do not see a lot of improvement in the relationship. And the Russians have actually did a lot of assistance to the Saudis by supporting their war in Yemen by being absent or by not objecting to that war. So I think the relationship are going to be okay, but it's not going to be fantastic. It will never replace the Saudi-American relationship like some might say.
All right. We only have 1 minute left for both of the other two gentlemen. Very briefly from you, we are talking about dramatic geopolitical changes or not as a result of this visit and the earlier visit by the prince, and probably more to come between Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, and the regions. Mr. Barbish, very briefly from you. 30 seconds. Thank you, sir.
Very briefly. Well, I don't think we're going to see a major change, because major change has already occurred when the Islamists lost in Syria. I would point your attention to the fact that the United States supported what Mr. Ivan called indiscriminate bombing of Yemen by the Saudis. So you have to blame President Obama and not President Trump for the breach of trust, for the lack of trust between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And last but not least, I think that relations between Russia and Saudi Arabia indeed vastly improved, primarily because Russia was consequential, unlike the United States, who betrayed their ally Mubarak and many other allies in the Middle East.
Okay, Mr. Eiland, finally your turn. 30 seconds. Thank you, sir.
Yes, I agree with your other guests in Washington. I think there's a limit to the improvement that can happen, simply because the two countries have different interests in the Middle East, specifically on Syria and relating to Iran. So I think it is limited. But also, it is a significant development in that, you know, they're trying to coordinate oil prices, which I don't think is going to work either, simply because there's so much cheating in any oil agreement, whether it's within OPEC or between OPEC and Russia.
Things are complicated, but we are seeing an unprecedented visit by the Saudi king to Russia. Thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for sharing your ideas and analysis. Ivan Eiland, Dimitri Barbish, Ali alAhmed, thank you. Really appreciate it.